Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alan Gingell, the Executive Director of the Institute. The reason we're here today, of course, is to listen to Michael Fulilove. I was in Washington about 2 weeks ago and discovered at a think tank that I was speaking at that they had also scheduled for the following day a meeting on the Obama's first 100 days. This was day 87. And I said to contacts there, I thought this was wasn't this a bit premature? And they said, no. Another think tank in Washington had their 100-day celebration at day 79, which gives you an example of the competitive environment in Washington DC. We're doing ours properly according to Australian timing anyway, at day 100. No one around has a better claim to be speaking about Obama over this period than my colleague Michael Fulilove, who's the director of our Global Issues program at the Institute. Michael has written extensively about Obama. He was early in writing about Obama's potential. And since then, he's been covering the issue in a number of American and Australian newspapers. He spent last year, the election year, at Brookings in the United States. He last spoke in this room about Obama's inauguration, and I invite him now to talk about what's happened since. Please welcome Michael Fulilove.
Thanks, Alan. I'm delighted to be back in Sydney, and one of the advantages of addressing the Institute in person rather than from Washington via video conference is that I can actually see who's in the room. And can I take the opportunity to acknowledge some friends of mine, including Michael Sexton and Matt Thistlethwaite and Neville Wran and other friends and supporters of me and the Institute. Thank you very much for coming. It is good, as Alan said, to be talking about Barack Obama on the 100th day of his presidency. That's assuming that you count his presidency from the time of his inauguration on the steps of the Capitol in Washington on the 20th of January. You might recall that Obama and Chief Justice Roberts mangled the oath of office, and Obama retook the oath the following day. So for those of you who believe that the initial oath was constitutionally suspect, I'll be back at this podium at lunchtime tomorrow to repeat my talk. For 3/4 of a century, presidents have been issued their first report card at the 100-day mark. And the term, as we've all read in the last couple of days, was first used to describe the remarkably productive period of legislative and executive activity in the first 3 months of FDR's presidency in 1933. Where we saw 15 major bills, 2 fireside chats and 30 press conferences. We saw the weaning of the United States off the gold standard, various financial regulations, the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and perhaps most welcome of all, the ending of Prohibition. And every president since FDR has struggled to meet the FDR gold standard. JFK deliberately avoided the 100-day formulation, saying in his inaugural address, "All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin." So JFK, along with others, has always tried to tamp down expectations. The last 100-day period that is commonly thought of as a success was Ronald Reagan's. In retrospect, it was thinner than it first appeared. He spent a lot of his time working on his tax-cutting budget, which wasn't passed until later. But his big success, and this he has in common, I think, with Obama, was to project his personality on the country and to inject a sense of optimism in the country and a sense of joie de vivre, especially after the assassination attempt on Reagan by John Hinckley Jr. on day 69 of his presidency. It's certainly true that if his 100 days was a little thin, he wins the award for making the best jokes in the first 100 days. Some of you will recall that when his wife Nancy arrived to see him in the emergency ward, he said, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And just before he went under the anaesthetic, he said, "Please tell me you're all Republicans." So what about Barack Obama's first 100 days? First of all, let me follow the journalist's standard practice and say two things. First of all, this is a completely arbitrary, if not insane, measure to apply to a president after he's only been in office for 3 months, and then two, go ahead and do it anyway. It's too much fun not to do it. Being Barack, he is staying cool about the whole thing. His administration is downplaying expectations. David Axelrod called the 100th day a hallmark holiday. Yet also being Barack, with the usual clinical precision, he and his team are going out of their way to maximise every last drop of political benefit. They are releasing candid photographs of him shooting hoops and hugging his wife to Time magazine and Slate. They're flying the president to Missouri for a speech tonight. Missouri, of course, being a state won by John McCain last November in the closest state result in the election, so he won by less than 0.2%, I think, in Missouri, scheduling a primetime news conference for this evening, putting out new ads on Obama's achievements. Now, at the level of politics, we can tell that Obama is off to a flying start. He has approval ratings at around the 65% mark, which has only been equalled recently by Ronald Reagan. For the first time since January 2004, that is shortly after the capture of Saddam Hussein, a larger percentage of Americans say that the country is headed in the right direction, that's 50%, than in the wrong direction, that's 40%. Before Obama took over, nearly 80% of Americans thought that the country was on the wrong track. Now, he is emerging, interestingly, as a polarising figure. Many people always think he presents as being above politics, but he is remarkably popular among Democrats, but he's actually quite unpopular among Republicans. Pew this month says that he has an 88% approval rate among Democrat voters and a 27% approval rate among Republicans. But that doesn't matter so much for Obama because the country is moving to the left, both in terms of voter affiliations, which have the lowest Republican affiliation numbers in decades, and also in terms of ideology and sorts of policies that Americans will accept. He is moving to the left as the country moves to the left. He is fortunate in the quality of his opponents. The Republicans are in the middle of an extended funk. They're suffering from relevance deprivation syndrome. Their arguments are askew. They're retreating to their base. And on this topic of the Republicans, if today is, as Axelrod said, a hallmark holiday, then some of you will have heard that Obama just got a big Valentine's Day card in the form of the announcement by Pennsylvania Senator Arlen Specter that he's defecting to the Democrats, moving the Democrats very, very close to a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. Now, leave aside the morality of a person who's represented the Republican Party in the Senate for 3 decades of his life, discarding that affiliation because it suits his political interests. Leave aside the question, as all the American media is, of whether it's appropriate that a 79-year-old who's been in the Senate for 29 years should be running for a 6th 6-year term. Leave those little questions of ethics and morality aside. The cold, hard reality is this is dreadful news for the Republican Party and marvellous news for Barack Obama. Stylistically, Obama is an enormous break from the past. I have spoken from this podium about Obama's remarkable gifts as a speechmaker. It's not just informal speeches, though. There was general gaping amazement in Washington during the transition during his first transition press conference about the complexity and the length and the sort of the 3-parted nature of his answers to questions. Journalists and the public are not used to the sort of subtlety and nuance with which the president comports himself. He's continuing to innovate in a technological sense, as many as those of you, for example, who've watched his Saturday morning video addresses on whitehouse.gov or YouTube can attest. He has the gift of appearing to be many things to many people. There was very little doubt ever about George W. Bush and where he stood and what he stood for. He wasn't good at disguising himself. Obama is very good at disguising himself, at governing from the left on issues but appearing to be a centrist. Thus, massive government intervention in the economy is the reassertion of small-town values. For example, when he restored federal funding for stem cell research, he somehow gave the impression, even though he did this very early and was very committed to the issue, that he had really struggled with the ethics of it. I'm reminded of my own hero, FDR, the famous story which Alan assures me I haven't used in a speech at the Lowy Institute, so I'll use now, is that when Harry Hopkins came to see Franklin Roosevelt in January 1941 to say that America must help the British, FDR listened very carefully to him and said, "Harry, you're absolutely right." And then Harold Ickes, who was Harry Hopkins' great nemesis in government, came in and said, "Mr. President, I know Hopkins has just been in here. I know what he will have told you. I know he will have said we've got to go and help the Brits, but we can't afford to do that. We've got to extend the New Deal in America." And FDR supposedly said, "Harold, you're absolutely right." And then Eleanor Roosevelt, who supposedly had been in an anteroom next to the Oval Office, sort of rushed in and said with sort of Protestant primness, "Franklin, I'm disgusted with what just happened. First of all, you listened to Harry and you told him you were absolutely right. Then you listened to Ickes tell you the exact opposite and you told him you're absolutely right. Now, what have you got to say for yourself?" And Franklin said, "Eleanor, you're absolutely right." So FDR has a little bit of that. Obama has a little bit of that to him. He also has some of FDR's ruthlessness, and we saw that, for example, in his appointment of Hillary as Secretary of State. That decision had all sorts of second and third order effects for all the people around Obama, people who'd split from the Clintons during the campaign to sign up for him. And a lot of those people that I worked with in Washington have been excluded from jobs in the Obama administration, or they've been shunted out from the centre and they're going for less interesting, important jobs than they might have got had he appointed any other human being in the universe as Secretary of State. But for Obama, it's about his success and the success of his administration, and other issues and other people are expendable. Finally, I think you see the remarkable confidence of Obama, and it is a sort of otherworldly swagger. Robert Gibbs, his press secretary, said in his first day in the White House, he was asked, how's he reacting? And Gibbs just said, well, he looks remarkably at ease in his surroundings. 4 years ago, this guy was a legislator in Springfield, Illinois. He's now sitting in the Oval Office and taking salutes as he gets onto Marine One, and this is not really a matter that requires much fuss. So he does have a sort of confidence that mere mortals like the rest of us could not muster. I might say here, I should acknowledge here, the incredible media pulling power of the President of the United States. This is something that I very much noticed living in the United States, how different a presidential system is from a prime ministerial system from a media perspective. In Australia, the Prime Minister is the first among equals, and even when he's a very powerful Prime Minister, as is Rudd, he is a member of the Cabinet, he's the leader of the Cabinet, but in the end, he will be pulled back into line if he gets too big for his boots. But in the presidential system, all power flows from the Godhead. All appointments, all policy, he's on a par with the whole of the Congress in terms of signing signing bills into law or vetoing bills. And that means that everything about the President of the United States is newsworthy. His BlackBerry, his dog, the vegetable patch in his house, anything to do with the Oval Office, whether it's the temperature that he maintains in the atmosphere, the fact that he doesn't insist on people wearing a jacket in the office, the replacement of the Churchill bust with one of Abraham Lincoln and one of Martin Luther King. When you think about the trappings of the US presidency, from Marine One to Air Force One to the White House to Camp David, it's remarkable how we as Australians know much more about those trappings than we do, for example, about Kirribilli House or number 34 Squadron of the RAF, which is tasked with flying around the Prime Minister and the Governor-General. So all these things, I think, give enormous visibility to the President. Now, that can be for good or for ill. and it's certainly no shield against bad press, but it does give an enormous advantage to someone who is very comfortable on the media side, as we've seen with Obama. Now, what can we say about the substance of Obama's first 100 days? And here I'm going to confine myself to some thematic comments about Obama's foreign policy. I'll leave the domestic policy for the moment, and I'll leave specific foreign policy issues for the Q&A. I think one measure of Obama's success is how effectively he has confused and wrong-footed all his opponents on the foreign policy right. This is a very, very tough time to be a neoconservative or a foreign policy conservative. You have watched the Bush administration stumble from one disaster to another and tumble to new depths of unpopularity. And this presents conservative commentators, whether in the United States or indeed in Australia, with a very difficult dilemma. Do you continue to wage holy war against this very popular president, or do you switch sides as carefully and unobtrusively as possible in the hope of getting that coveted invitation to the White House or that interview on Air Force One? Do you throw pebbles at the bandwagon, or do you climb aboard? And we're seeing all sorts of strange things at the moment. It's a bit like the end of days, I think. We're not exactly seeing fish speaking and dogs walking on their hind legs, but I was astonished to see Dick Cheney calling for the release of memos detailing intelligence supposedly gained from the harsh interrogation of detainees. After years of fighting tooth and nail to prevent the release of classified documents, Cheney is now all in favour of the release of classified documents. This is the man who wielded extraordinary, unprecedented power in the executive branch, but who argued in 2007 that he wasn't actually a part of the executive branch, speaking constitutionally, in an attempt to evade a legal requirement for him to preserve classified materials that he would prefer to shred. So we're seeing remarkable things on the right. And we're seeing in particular two entirely contradictory arguments in the conservative commentary about Obama's foreign policy. The first is that Obama is the opposite of Bush. The second is that he is a repetition of Bush. First of all, we're hearing that he's the opposite of Bush, that he's weak, supine and bloodless. Karl Rove said in the Wall Street Journal on Obama's trip to Europe earlier this month, the op-ed was entitled "The President's Apology Tour." He said that Obama is going around confessing our nation's sins. Bloggers got irate about Obama apparently bowing or kissing the ring of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. Frank Gaffney, a prominent neocon, called Obama's foreign policy a wrecking operation that will not only weaken the United States but embolden our foes. He's also said that Obama is not a natural-born citizen of the United States and that he's embracing the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood. Nicole Wallace, the former McCain staffer, has accused Obama of following George Costanza's approach in the opposite, of doing the opposite of what Bush would do in any situation. And finally, the big daddy of all this, Charles Krauthammer, has been very big on this argument. He had an op-ed in the Post a couple of weeks ago called "It's Your Country Too, Mr. President," where he characterised Obama's Europe trip as gift-giving. He said the US president came bearing a basket full of mea culpas. With varying degrees of directness or obliqueness, Obama indicted his own people for arrogance, for dismissiveness and derisiveness, for genocide, torture, for Hiroshima, for Guantanamo, and for insufficient respect for the Muslim world. He said, Obama shows disdain for his own country while on foreign soil, acting the philosopher king who hovers above the fray, mediating between his renegade homeland and an otherwise warm and welcoming world. It is passing strange, said Krauthammer, for a world leader to celebrate his own country's decline. A few more such overseas tours and Obama will have a lot more decline to celebrate. So that's one argument, that Obama is the anti-Bush and he's weak and he lacks Bush's strength and decisiveness. On the other hand, conservatives are telling us that in fact Obama is presiding over a foreign policy that's very, very similar to Bush's, from the continuity of Gates in the Pentagon to the Predator strikes against Pakistani militants to continuation of the operations in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. Peter Feaver from the Bush administration and from Duke University calls Obama's foreign policy the same policy under a different letterhead. And the leader of this camp, Bob Kagan, in the Post, says that the basic goals and premises of US policy have not shifted. And he ended this particular op-ed with the ironic cry, "Viva la revolution." Now, this argument is, of course, completely and utterly misleading. Any country's foreign policy has strong elements of continuity created by history, geography, wealth, population and position in the international system. But within that broad structure of continuity, changes of government cause very significant alterations to international policy, or indeed why else would somebody like Bob Kagan himself have signed up as an advisor to John McCain if he thought it wouldn't really make any difference? A short list of early differences between Obama and Bush on foreign policy would include a different military plan for the withdrawal of combat troops from Iraq, setting in train the closure of the detention facility at Guantanamo, the declaration without reservation that the US will not torture, and the release of documents that show that it did in the past, the ending of the Bush administration's macabre dance of climate change, denial, scepticism and delay, a policy of engaging with US adversaries. Will the United States decommission its army and adopt a foreign policy that's appropriate for a small left-wing Scandinavian country? Negative. But according to most historical precedents, this is most definitely change we can believe in. This is a little like, actually, the argument on Australian foreign policy that a lot of people made after the election of Kevin Rudd. Lots of officials and cognoscenti argued then that Kevin Rudd's creative middle-plough diplomacy was really just a synonym for John Howard's practical and realistic foreign policy. No one really much is arguing that now. Rudd has run a different policy on the alliance. He has a different approach to international institutions. He's running initiatives on climate change, nuclear weapons and Asia-Pacific diplomacy that Howard probably would not have touched with a barge pole. Why is Rudd running a different policy? Because he's a different person, he leads a different kind of government, and because the election of a Labor government changes the political and media environment in which policy is made, and the same applies in the United States. So, if both wings of the conservative movement have got Obama wrong, how should we think about his emerging foreign policy? How is he coping with the very challenging international situation he's inherited from Bush? Bloody conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, nuclear programs in Iran and North Korea, persistent terrorist networks, newly assertive US competitors, a broken Middle East peace process, a financial meltdown, a shrinking economy and a warming planet. The answer is he is off to a very sure-footed start. He is enormously comfortable. He has been on the world stage for about 10 seconds and he is already the closest that we have to a conductor. He's carried out the spirit of his campaign promises on Iraq and Afghanistan while adjusting them to the reality of the situation and the advice of his commanders. He struck a new tone in America's relations with the world, especially with the awkward squad. However, it's also true to say that he has not faced significant tests yet, and it is much too early to identify the fruits of Obama's new approach. Let me point quickly to 4 themes that I see in Obama's foreign policy. The first is pragmatism. If you were to sequence Obama's political genome, you would certainly find the gene for pragmatism. You don't get from Illinois politics to the Oval Office in 4 years without an instinctive attraction to things that work. And his writings and his speeches on foreign policy tend to lack ideological content. Unlike Mr. Bush, he doesn't dwell on the roles of good and evil in the affairs of humankind. We've seen his pragmatism throughout his political career, throughout his campaign. I think the policies he's announced on Iraq and Afghanistan so far reveal a determination to listen to expert advice. We've seen since his inauguration a certain kind of wonky professorial pragmatism to some of his statements, and let me give you two examples. The first is this. In London, he said, he was asked about, what kind of outcome are we going to get from the World Economic Summit in London? He said, well, look, negotiations are no longer Roosevelt and Churchill sitting in a room with a brandy. That's not the world we live in, and it shouldn't be the world that we live in. This is a completely matter-of-fact statement that's accurate in all its essentials, but it did open the gate for Krauthammer and others to argue that Obama is acknowledging America's decline. And so it does show this sort of strangely clear-eyed and non-political way of looking at the world. Similarly, he said in Europe, he was asked, do you believe in American exceptionalism? And he said this, I believe in American exceptionalism just as I suspect that the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. Well, no, I'm afraid he didn't get the memo there. What he should have said is, America is entirely unique. It is uniquely unique. We're a shining city on a hill. No other country has an exceptionalism like our exceptionalism, which is truly exceptional. And Americans are blessed among the peoples of the world, and it is our responsibility to bring these blessings to the others. He missed out on that memo, and that's why I'm worried about this analytical pragmatism that would not be strange perhaps in the Lowy Institute, but is very strange coming from a presidential lectern. Secondly, I want to argue that Obama is ambitious, and this is linked obviously to his confidence and to the ease with which he conducts himself. He has signalled a very ambitious approach to a number of issues, what the hollow men on the ABC would call a raft of initiatives. He's promised to change the way America is perceived in the world, especially in the Muslim world, to work towards a nuclear-free world, to bring peace to the Holy Land, to avert a climate catastrophe at the same time that he fixes the GFC and the GEC. And all this is on top of an enormously ambitious and crowded domestic agenda. This, again, here I think you can see a bit of a similarity to Rudd, to the very long list of foreign policy ambitions that Rudd has signalled, the initiatives that he's set in train simultaneously across a range of different issues. It's certainly good to see people with ambition in those jobs rather than people just letting it all sort of wash over them. But at the same time, I do worry from time to time about the limits to the ability of the American system to absorb all of the policies that Obama is throwing at it and all the changes that he threatens to throw at it on the foreign policy side. Third, I want to argue that there is a lot of liberalism visible in what Obama does on the world stage. We know he had a very liberal voting record in Illinois and in the US Senate. And unlike other Democratic presidential candidates, he did not stew for decades in the Washington foreign policy soup. Unlike most Democrats, for example, he didn't believe that he had to look tougher than the Republicans in order to win in November. And you see his liberalism in many of his comments and his policies, the way he downplays freedom in favour of development. For example, in his book, he suggests that people are not looking for what he calls an electocracy. They're looking more for the basic elements that define a decent life and the ability to make their way through life without having to endure corruption, violence, or arbitrary power. If you look at his Prague speech on nukes, or his comments on climate change, or indeed the release of the torture memos, which was the subject of enormous disputation even within the Obama White House, you see a liberalism that we haven't seen for a while on the foreign policy side. And finally, and related to this issue of liberalism, is the centrality of diplomacy in the way he believes America should conduct itself. He sent lots of signals during the campaign that America's stance had to be balanced away from the use of force and over towards diplomacy. He then went on to appoint one of the world's most famous people and his fiercest political rival as his chief diplomat. On his second full day in office, he made that symbolic commute from the White House to the State Department to emphasise the centrality of diplomacy to his international approach. He appointed huge personalities, big beasts with enormous egos like Dick Holbrooke, to big special diplomatic envoy jobs. He is not a pacifist, of course, as the Somali pirates holding Captain Richard Phillips found out, but the emphasis that he puts on diplomacy is new. He has gone out of his way to engage US adversaries, recording a conciliatory video message to the Iranian people to commemorate the Persian New Year, to shake hands with Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, make nice with Evo Morales of Bolivia and Daniel Ortega of Nicaragua. This is Chavez, who in 2006 went to the United Nations and spoke the day after Bush, and when he got up to the podium said, I'm here today, the devil came yesterday, and the podium still smells of sulphur. That was Chavez's last substantive interaction with the US president. Now Obama's giving him high fives and receiving gifts from him. He has softened the long-term travel restrictions to Cuba for those with Cuban heritage and allowed dollar remittances to relatives in Cuba. So he's engaging with this strange little regime in Havana. His administration has spoke of pressing reset on the relationship with Russia. And you remember Hillary Clinton handed the red button to her Russian counterpart, and he signalled, for example, that missile defence in Eastern Europe is tied to issues of the Iranian nuclear weapons program. Now, after 8 years of President Bush throwing his weight around, this is, of course, refreshing. It's refreshing that the world is not always divided into black and white. It's leading to enormous fretting, as I mentioned, on the right, but, of course, it's hard to know what else Obama could do. In a reality-based world, somebody like Chavez is the president of Venezuela. Obama obviously wants to live in the reality-based world. So I think Obama is right to privilege diplomacy in the way he has and to reach out to awkward countries. But let me finish on this. Let me finish on a criticism, if I may. I think there is also something to the criticisms that Obama has been very quick to compromise in his first 100 days. Domestically, he gave in to congressional Democrats who wanted to preserve the farm subsidies. On the issue of veterans' health costs, he decided not to have a go at renewing the ban on assault weapons that expired in 2004. Chris Buckley, in today's FT, says Obama seems almost preternaturally cool. You get the feeling you could smack him across the face with a dead haddock and he'd just chuckle. The problem is, international relations is an unsentimental business. Not all international relations problems are susceptible to rational agreement in the absence of leverage and pressure. And regimes like that in Pyongyang are not too fussed about Obama's exotic lineage or his fine words or his Portuguese water dog Bo. So Obama needs to make sure that his reasonableness is not mistaken for weakness. And I think this goes back to the dilemma that was posed by Machiavelli, or answered, I should say, by Machiavelli: is it better to be feared or loved? And I'll end on this point. Machiavelli said the answer, of course, is that it would be best to be both loved and feared. But since the two rarely come together, anyone compelled to choose will find greater security in being feared than in being loved. And the reason that Machiavelli posed for that answer went to the nature of men, but it could equally be said of states, that they are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous, and as long as you succeed, they are yours entirely. They will offer you their blood, property, life, and children, but when it approaches, they turn against you. So, as Obama moves to deal with the nuclear program in Tehran, for example, as he moves to deal with an awkward new government in Israel and divided Palestinians on the other side, as he deals with a recalcitrant Russia, as he starts to try to force his way through the thicket of national interests on climate change, then let me close by suggesting that along with Miles Davis and Jay-Z, he may wish to download a bit of Machiavelli onto the BlackBerry. Thank you.